because this right now is the greatest country on earth.
This is Global Insights by Network 2020. Today, we're looking back at an earlier discussion we had on the central question: is America in decline?
Yes, yes, and yes. Yes in the military, yes in the economic, and yes also in the diplomatic alliance and international relationships. I think we have slid.
The theory that America's position has been declining in recent years has led to much debate in foreign policy circles. Is that decline based on perception or reality? Do America's adversaries, such as China and Russia, take advantage of that to bolster and justify their own positions and actions? And what does all this mean for the rest of the international community? For this discussion, we were joined by Professor Paul Kennedy and Dr. Jessica Mathews. Professor Kennedy is Professor of History and Director of International Security Studies at Yale, as well as Distinguished Fellow of the Brady Johnson Program in Grand Strategy. Dr. Mathews is a Distinguished Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, who served as Carnegie's president for 18 years. Moderating the discussion is Joanna Gwalczewski.
So let me just start by asking a question for both of you. How do you see America's current position in the world? Is the United States in decline? And how would you define decline? If the United States is in decline, is it irreversible? So let me start with Dr. Mathews first.
Yes, it's a pleasure to be with you. Yes, I think the answer has to be yes. I'm defining it not in terms of raw power, but in terms of capacity to lead, which has an element of raw power and of economic strength, but also has a very large component of how the rest of the world sees us and how we perform. And by that measure, starting long before Trump, I think one would have to say that the US is in decline. When the rest of the world looks at us, they don't see confident leadership, clear leadership. They see the 2003 invasion of Iraq. They see the subsequent destabilization of the Middle East. And they see a lot of obviously false arguments that went into that invasion, like that we were going to bring democracy to the Middle East. They see the 2008 financial crisis, which destabilized most of the world economically. So those are the big ones, but they also see a pretty incoherent policy in Syria and some ill-judged humanitarian interventions. And they see, and this is something that very few people recognize, that the United States Senate has basically gone out of the business of ratifying multilateral treaties for the last quarter century, 25 years, just a rather minor treaty that it has managed to ratify, with the result that the world can't negotiate treaties in which it's important for the US to be a member because they know we can't ratify it, as for example with climate. And there is a clear loss of commitment for a country that thinks of itself as a leader, and which for most of the post-war era was the leader. And then you would have to also add into the ledger that for the first year plus of the pandemic, the United States handled it worse than any other country. with the world's strongest medical and scientific establishment behind it. We, by the beginning of this summer, we were 25% of the world's cases and 19% of the deaths for a country that is 4% of the world's population. So I could go on and talk about the additions to that sorry record that President Trump brought. But let me stop here and say that in this crucial element of the capacity to lead, the world holds you, the trust in which it can put, yes, I would say the US is clearly in decline.
Do you think that it's irreversible? Do you think that there's still the potential to change?
But I don't think, and we'll go into, I mean, given the situation of our domestic politics, I don't think it can be reversed quickly.
Mhm.
But it is certainly not irreversible.
All right, thank you. And Professor Kennedy, the same question is America in decline?
All right. Yes, yes, and yes, with reservations, of course, in all three. So yes, in regard to the military commitments it has to try to sustain across the globe and the military resources it possesses. Its capacities there are significantly less than they were, say, back in the age of JFK. So yes, in the military overstretched realm. Yes, in the economic, technological shares of world power and shares of world high-tech capacities, which I worry about a great deal. I'd like us also to talk about. And yes, also in the areas that Jessica has talked about, which is the relationships to our alliances and relationships to the extraordinary international organization network, which we set up and led with such confidence for many years. So in those three areas, the military, the economic, technological, and the diplomatic alliance and international relationships, I think we have slid. If you are saying, is it reversible? I certainly think I understand what Jessica is saying about the nature of the Senate reluctance to do anything, the internal fissures which make unified policy in diplomatic leadership and commitment so difficult. It's not impossible. I wake up some mornings thinking of an age when the US Senate leaders came over to FDR's White House to talk through and listen to what is going on. Maybe that's a dream, but in that element, there's surely political leadership could turn a lot of things around. In terms of the economic and technological decline in our share and our capacities, I rather doubt it. We may lead in certain areas, but I think we have lost the lead in the production of microchips and certain other high-tech economic productive capacities. Hard to reverse that. And in the military realm, well, that depends on whether we can have a good look at the relationship between our military capacities and our military obligations and try to prioritize there. If we could, we might be able to sustain ourselves in the world a lot better than we have done.
All right, thank you. So, what you both said basically is that yes, we are in decline, particularly in the economic tech sector, but there's still some hope that maybe we can reverse it. So my next question then for you, Dr. Mathews, what are America's greatest domestic challenges and what should its policy priorities be?
Well, this one is really easy to answer. Our biggest challenge is that the foundations of our democracy are in jeopardy, and it's almost, you have to almost kind of catch yourself when you say those words, because 3 years ago would have been inconceivable to say that our ability to run an election that all of our people trust, our ability to have a peaceful transition of power, our capacity of our population to at least know enough facts and about our status and about the world to have semi-intelligent opinions. All of that would have been, of course, we had all of those things. And now we are in, I think, imminent jeopardy of losing the ability to carry out a fair and trusted election, and one where who gets to vote and in what jurisdictions actually reflects our population is in jeopardy. And once that's gone, you can't run a democracy.
So do you have some ideas about how that could be, addressed?
Well, some of them are more hopes that Donald Trump gets taken away, gets seen as illegitimate way through court actions or the like, or his own behavior. More long term, I think we have to get rid of the Electoral College, which is doable because it's not in the Constitution. And it is less difficult than it seems until you actually look at it. States holding the majority of the country's population to say that they only cast their votes for whomever has the majority of the votes in their state. It's doable. Whether it will happen in anytime soon is a different question. And there are other proposals that are being considered, like universal voting, the way Australia, for example, has it, where everybody has to vote, even if you vote no choice. The ways to, and then if Congress can pass the voting reform bills that would prevent a complete breakdown of the system in 24. So there are answers. They don't look terribly hopeful right now. Everything that we worried about last January has gotten worse, not better. So, but I think I guess what I really want to say is that nobody should underestimate the degree of jeopardy that the way of political life that we take absolutely for granted, in how deep danger it is.
Thank you.
So, nothing else comes close in terms of priorities.
Right. No, thank you very much for that answer. Now, if I can switch to you, Professor Kennedy, and follow up on something that you discussed very briefly. Has the U.S. reached the point where it has overextended its capabilities and commitments like other great powers in the past, such as Great Britain? But what are some of the opportunities that the United States can seize, given these challenges that it has externally?
Look, the fact that we, political commentators, strategic studies people, and historians like myself say this looks like some of the great powers overstretch of the past, it's eerily reminiscent of the time, say, when Great Britain a century ago, and around 1900, was still the #1 naval power by far, had by far the largest set of overseas bases, cable communications network that nobody else had. But at that time, it was facing a crisis in the maybe breakdown of China. It was looking at Russian advances across Central Asia towards India. It had a near war with France in the Nile and West Africa. It was trying to keep its eye on the ambitions of Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany. And when you put together all of the challenges across different parts of the globe, and even though it was #1, it's overstretched. So that, I think, is what is going on here. maybe close to the possibility that this Christmas, two rather malignant leaderships in Moscow and Beijing may be talking with each other, will each decide to put pressure in two very different parts of the globe. And you know what I'm talking about. On the Ukraine borders, perhaps creating an internal incident there, nice present for us on Boxing Day, and ever more overflight of a Chinese aircraft across Taiwan. If one of those accidentally gets shot down, we have an immediate Taiwan crisis and a possibility of an immediate Ukraine crisis, with another malevolent leadership like Iran doing something to upset us, say, in the Persian Gulf. And if we look at the list of our sort of military assets, we can see that where do we put our eggs? How many of our surface forces do we put in the Far East as opposed to in the Eastern Mediterranean or in the Baltic? That's the way the military count. And from their viewpoint, it's quite clear they feel overstretched.
Mm-hmm.
As a non-profit organization, Network 2020 relies on the generosity of listeners like you. If you enjoy our thought-provoking discussions, we kindly ask you to consider making a donation at network2020.org. Your support ensures we keep delivering the content you love. From all of us, thank you.
So what should the United States do, especially seeing this partnership between Beijing right now and Moscow? How could the United States offset that partnership?
Well, I think that first we should use the strongest language that diplomacy can allow. And I'm glad President Biden had that conversation with Putin a couple of days ago. And I think there should be increasingly firm and strong languages to those three potential upsetters of our place in the world, that is Iran, Russia, and China, that if they go too far, they could be responsible for destabilizing things and producing a stronger reaction. But say no more than that. And don't talk about we're not going to do this or we're not going to do that, because that gives the game away. Secondly, really have a serious look through the National Security Council, surely, at the deployments of where we have. I know President Biden justifiably has spent this first year looking at the economy and COVID. But there has to be a time where he and the vice president and the senior ministers look and go off for a weekend and just look at the dispositions of our forces across the globe, and then look at the list of obligations we have, and then thirdly, look at the list of alliances, the plus side of American diplomacy, which we can bring in. We need a global look sometime, and sometime soon.
Thank you. Dr. Mathews, is there anything you would like to add to that?
Yeah, I have somewhat different view about our military strength. It's true that China is now, after many, many years of spending very little on the military, is spending a lot and is catching up both quantitatively and qualitatively, in particular with the hypersonic missiles. But I think that I would say that in terms of raw military power, this is one area where we're not in decline. We are spending roughly $800 billion a year on defense, which is more than the next 8 powers, including Russia and China, combined spend. We spend it poorly. We waste probably, military people estimate numbers as high as maybe even a third of it is poorly spent. and we are too devoted to legacy systems, to old World War II systems that proved themselves long, long, long ago, and spend too little on the new digitally managed systems, small weapons that can attack in swarms and that use artificial intelligence and are quite a different thing than an aircraft carrier, which is vulnerable to a tiny little missile. So this is an area where we need to do better. And need to recognize how much we pour into spending in this area. But I wouldn't say we're in decline. Where I would agree is the connection between weaponry and military power and military capacity, which in terms of training and logistics and management, which ours is superb. That and our greatest asset, which is the breadth and depth historically of our international relationships, friendships, principally in Europe, but also increasingly in Asia. And there, I totally agree with Paul. It is the revitalization of those relationships that will, and that can come. I think that is probably easier to fix than our domestic politics, our domestic polarization. But the biggest mistake that hurts us enormously now of recent years was Trump's throwing away of the Iran nuclear deal when the Iranians were totally in compliance with it. That so undermines people's trust in our capacity to make agreements and then to keep them, that it's going to be a long time before it's forgotten. And in fact, it may be a very long time before the problem of the Iranian nuclear weapon is dealt with one way or another, and it could be a terrible outcome. So I think it's to understand the nature of the decline, which is partly a natural growth and rebirth of others. It's nuanced, and to me, the core of it is our dysfunction at home. There are just too many issues, starting with the pandemic, right, that have no business being a partisan issue, that are partisan and that so distort our ability to make sensible policy that we are really crippled by it.
Thank you. So given, as you mentioned, the technological advances and America's not adjusting militarily to these advances, as well as different powers asserting themselves more than in the past, perhaps, because maybe they do perceive America's strength is declining, so they feel more emboldened. How will this affect the rest of the international community? I think that is one of the major questions. How do other countries react to these great powers, all shifting alliances and having different priorities? How will that impact? So if I could start with you, Professor Kennedy.
So look, allow me to put a basic statistic on the table, which I do often to my Yale undergraduates to think about. And I'm glad Jessica brought it up in a bleak way when she said, we have only 4% of the world's population. So I put a screen chart of just 3 pie charts showing that right about now, the US has approximately 40% of world's total defense spending. It is enormous at $800 billion and some extra on the side for operations. 40% of defense spending, depending on the way you count it, and some economists want to do it one way and the other, we may have something like 19% of world GDP or 21% of world GDP, but it's about half of the defense spending share in the world. And then we have 4% of the world's population. So to me, it's quite staggering to think that this single nation, with its 4%, and it's being one of the 200 members of the United Nations, has about a fifth of the world's economic heft and about, what would you say, 40% of the world's military heft. But over time, probably as other countries rise, our share of world economic production will start to go further down relatively. And therefore, it's likely that we actually have to keep spending more and more, or we reduce our defense share of spending share, that is, of total defense spending. So in a relative term, we have a big struggle. And therefore, and I think Jessica come back again and again to nifty, principled leadership, working with like-minded countries and allies to help out this enormous big juggling act. This is where I think getting a nice message and a reassuring message to our allies is significant. And where, if we can do it really at the time when we look so fractured and disconnected and discombobulated from the outside, that is a really big challenge.
Thank you. Professor Kennedy, since the Cold War ended, the United States has been searching for a guiding principle or ideological driver to help shape foreign policy. Given America's domestic challenges and political division, is fresh thinking even possible to develop a new effective approach to foreign policy?
I'm skeptical about any single slogan that should be defining our place in the world and the message that we send out in the world. I think, first of all, we should really be thinking of getting ourselves in better shape at home, the big difficulty, as Jessica said, before we can preach to the world. I think a policy of saying we are going to support our allies and like-minded countries, we should beat that drumbeat all the time. I'm really glad that President Biden is going to lead this conference with the democratic nations and asserting democracy. It is something that terrifies these regimes which are trying to upset us. And so we should be more confident of the democratic message and reach out to those who are like-minded with us, with Australia, with Japan, with the European countries, some of the African countries too, our Latin American friends. We have a lot to do on the diplomatic front, but a steady message of reassurance and that we have certain principles we are going to uphold needs to be said again and again and again. There's nothing wrong with doing that so long as we are not boastful about it, and so long as we realize that we have to do a bit of give and take with allies who would love to work with us, provided we are not singly one-sided in our policies and upsetting allies by not consulting them in advance.
Thank you so much. In the few minutes that we have remaining, what do you believe is America's strongest asset that could help lead the country through its current difficulties? So if I can start with you, Professor Kennedy.
Oh, we have such a variety of assets. My mind is going through those positive ones that you ask for. But I do think in terms of a cultural message of openness, of a training of a new generation of people who will go out into the world and interact in other societies, if we can allow them to do so, if COVID will allow them to do so. The resources of civilization, Mr. Gladstone said when he had a great problem on Ireland, the resources of civilization are not yet exhausted. I think the resources of our civilization and our political leadership are not exhausted, even though they depress Jessica and myself a great deal. So I do think something of a steadfast message at the top from our political leadership would be something I would welcome to the greatest degree, because if that happens, consistency between president and the Congress over time, And a whole lot of things which we see as issues in like decaying military hardware can surely be solved. The other one, leadership and national trust, is a far more difficult, precarious, but absolutely essential thing to turn to. And I do think we have the capacity to do it if you want to be positive.
And Dr. Mathews?
You know, we have a very long history of problem solving, of solving our problems, of overcoming. And that's there in all of our collective memories. What I'm sorry to say something negative in a positive answer, but what has changed is that we now are turning political disagreements into personality, into hatred. And that stifles what has been a country of can-doers, of we can solve this, we can work together, we can deal with this with, you know, neighbors and community leaders and friends who maybe we don't agree with on big national issues, but we'll do this. So while I would single out that history of solving problems successfully as a huge asset that's there, if we can dig back to it, it is now covered by this horrible thing of extending political or ideological differences into personal relationships that makes it impossible to come back to that. But there it is still in the past.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a fascinating discussion, and I will now turn it over to Courtney.
Well, thank you both. Thank you, Joanna, so much for leading this discussion. Dr. Mathews, Professor Kennedy, thank you so much. It was a thoughtful, sobering conversation. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Same. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jessica.
It's listeners like you that make Global Insights so special. To stay connected, deepen your insights, and join our community, visit us at network2020.org.